The mining colony on Kepler 442b had been quiet for 3 weeks. Too quiet, according to Dr. Sarah Chen, the colony's xenobiologist. She stood at the observation deck of Research Station Alpha, watching the crimson sun cast long shadows across the alien landscape. The planet's twin moons hung low in the amber sky, their pale light mixing with the dying daylight. "Marcus, you need to come back to the station." Sarah spoke into her communicator, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "The seismic readings are showing unusual activity in Sector 7. Static crackled through the device before a young voice responded. "Mom, I'm fine. The rock formations here are incredible. I think I found something that might be fossilized remains of Marcus Chen. You get back here right now." Sarah's voice carried the authority that only a concerned mother could muster. "You know the rules about exploring alone." 15-year-old Marcus Chen was nothing if not stubborn. He had inherited his mother's scientific curiosity and his late father's adventurous spirit. The combination often led him into situations that made Sarah's hair turn grayer by the day. Unlike the other colonist children who stayed close to the settlement, Marcus felt drawn to the planet's mysteries like a moth to flame. "Just give me 30 more minutes," Marcus pleaded. "I promise I'll head back before the temperature drops." Sarah closed her eyes and counted to 10. The boy had been acting restless since they arrived on Kepler 442b 6 months ago. The loss of his father in the mining accident on Europa had changed something in Marcus. He seemed to be searching for something in the alien wilderness, though Sarah wasn't sure what. 20 minutes, Marcus. Not a second more." Marcus grinned as he pocketed the communicator. He was crouched beside a strange rock formation that seemed to spiral upward like a frozen tornado. The stone was unlike anything in the geological surveys. It had a metallic sheen that reflected the dual moonlight in patterns that almost looked deliberate. The planet Kepler 442b was considered one of the more habitable worlds in human space. The atmosphere was breathable, though thin, and the gravity was only slightly higher than Earth normal. The indigenous life forms were mostly plant-based, with a few small creatures that resembled Earth's insects. The colonists had never encountered anything larger than a house cat. That was about to change. Marcus was carefully chipping away at the base of the formation when he heard the first howl. It started low, almost like the wind through the canyon walls, then rose to a pitch that made his teeth ache. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He froze, the geological hammer still in his hand. In 6 months on the planet, he had never heard anything like that sound. The colonists' surveys had been thorough. There were no large predators on Kepler 442b. At least that's what everyone believed. The howl came again, closer this time, and Marcus realized he was no longer alone. He slowly turned around and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. 3 creatures emerged from behind the rock formations, moving with the fluid grace of born hunters. They were roughly the size of earth wolves, but that's where the similarity ended. Their bodies were covered in scales that shifted color like oil on water, reflecting the alien moonlight in hypnotic patterns. 6 legs carried them across the rocky terrain with impossible speed and silence. Their heads were elongated, almost reptilian, with rows of crystalline teeth that gleamed like diamonds. But it was their eyes that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. They were intelligent. These weren't simple beasts driven by hunger or territorial instinct. There was calculation in those multifaceted orbs, strategy and purpose that spoke of a sophisticated predator. The lead creature, slightly larger than the others, tilted its head and studied Marcus with an expression that seemed almost curious. It made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, and the other 2 responded by spreading out to flank the human boy. Marcus's hand moved slowly toward his communicator, but the lead creature's eyes tracked the movement instantly. It made a sharp clicking sound, and suddenly Marcus felt a strange pressure in his mind, like someone was gently probing the edges of his thoughts. The sensation was so unexpected that Marcus stumbled backward, losing his footing on the loose rocks. The geological hammer clattered away into the darkness. He was now sitting on the ground, back pressed against the spiral rock formation, with 3 alien predators forming a perfect triangle around him. "Mom," he whispered into the communicator, not daring to speak louder. "I need help. There are things here. They're not in any of our surveys." Static answered him. The creatures had positioned themselves to block his line of sight to the research station. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, Marcus couldn't tell, but the implications were terrifying either way. The lead creature took a step closer, and Marcus could see details that made his skin crawl. The scales weren't just changing color for camouflage. They were creating patterns, symbols that seemed to flow across the creature's hide like living text. The other two creatures bore similar markings but different patterns, as if they were communicating through their skin. Marcus forced himself to think scientifically. These creatures were clearly intelligent, possibly more intelligent than initial observations suggested. They had language, or at least a sophisticated form of communication. They had also demonstrated what seemed like rudimentary telepathic abilities. The pressure in his mind increased, and suddenly Marcus could feel something else. Emotions that weren't his own. Curiosity, yes, but also something like amusement? The creatures weren't just hunting him. They were studying him just as he had been studying their planet. The lead creature made another sound, a complex series of clicks and harmonics that the others repeated back. Then to Marcus's amazement, it sat down, not in a predatory crouch, but in an almost casual posture that suggested patience. They were waiting for something. But what? Marcus tried his communicator again, but still received only static. The research station seemed impossibly far away, even though he knew it was less than 2 kilometers distant. The alien landscape, beautiful in daylight, had transformed into something ominous under the twin moons. The creatures continued their patient vigil, their scale patterns shifting and flowing in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as conversation. Whatever they were discussing, he was clearly the subject. The question was whether he was being evaluated as a threat, a curiosity, or dinner. As the temperature began to drop with the setting of the primary sun, Marcus realized that his 30-minute exploration had turned into something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The standoff continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Marcus tried to control his breathing, knowing that showing fear might trigger an attack response. The creatures seemed content to wait, their scaled hides continuing their mesmerizing pattern displays. Marcus decided to try something that his xenobiology textbooks would probably call incredibly stupid. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The lead creature's head tilted further, and the patterns on its scales shifted to something that reminded Marcus of flowing water. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said softly, feeling foolish for talking to aliens who probably couldn't understand human speech. "I'm just exploring like you're exploring me." The creature's response was immediate and startling. The pressure in Marcus's mind intensified, but instead of feeling invasive, it felt almost gentle. Images flashed through his consciousness, not his own memories, but something else entirely. He saw the research station from above, as if viewed from a great height. He saw the mining equipment scattered across the landscape like metallic insects. He saw himself, small and alone among the rock formations, from the perspective of the creatures watching him. But then the images changed, becoming older, deeper. Marcus saw Kepler 442b as it had been before the human colonists arrived. The planet teemed with life that the surveys had somehow missed. Cities of crystal and living stone stretched across continents. The wolf-like creatures were everywhere, but they walked upright in some of the visions, using tools, creating art. "You're not animals," Marcus whispered in amazement. "You're people." The lead creature made a sound that might have been agreement. The mental pressure eased, and Marcus found himself looking at the three beings with entirely new eyes. They weren't predators circling prey. They were researchers studying an alien visitor, just as human scientists might study a new species. "Where did everyone go?" Marcus asked, not really expecting an answer, but hoping the telepathic connection might convey his meaning. The response came as a flood of images and emotions that nearly overwhelmed his young mind. He saw the planet's cities fading, not destroyed, but somehow translucent. The creatures themselves became fewer, more ethereal. There was a sense of great sadness, but also of purpose and hope. They were dying, not individually, but as a species. Some kind of evolutionary shift was taking place, one that was moving them beyond physical existence. Most of their kind had already made the transition to whatever came next. These three were among the last, choosing to remain in physical form to witness the arrival of the new inhabitants of their world. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks without realizing he was crying. The profound loneliness and sacrifice these beings had endured was almost unbearable. They had watched their entire civilization transcend physical reality while they stayed behind, alone, to be guardians of their world. But why? Marcus asked aloud. Why stay? Why not go with the others? The answer came not in images but in pure emotion. Love. Love for their planet. Love for the new life that would grow here. And something else. Something that took Marcus a moment to understand. They had been waiting for humanity. Not humans specifically, but for another species to reach the stars, to find this place, to begin the long journey toward whatever the original inhabitants had become. The lead creature stood and approached Marcus slowly. Up close, he could see that its scales weren't entirely physical. They seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, shifting between solid matter and something else entirely. The creature extended what might have been considered an arm, though it flowed like liquid metal. Marcus reached out hesitantly and touched the offered appendage. The contact sent a shock through his system, but not of pain. It was like touching a live electrical wire made of pure information. Knowledge flooded his mind, not just about the creatures, but about the planet itself. Kepler 442b wasn't just a habitable world. It was a carefully prepared garden, shaped over millions of years to be perfect for carbon-based life. The mineral deposits that had attracted the human mining operation weren't natural formations. They were gifts, left behind by the previous inhabitants to help the newcomers develop the technology they would eventually need. The strange rock formation Marcus had been studying wasn't a geological feature. It was a beacon, designed to attract curious minds and begin this exact conversation. The creatures had been waiting for someone to find it, someone with the right combination of scientific curiosity and open-mindedness to make contact. You chose me, Marcus realized. But why me? Why not one of the adult scientists? The answer came with a warmth that felt like mental laughter. Adults, the creatures seemed to suggest, were too set in their thinking, too bound by their preconceptions of what was possible. A young mind, especially one already touched by loss and searching for meaning, was far more likely to accept the impossible. Marcus understood something else in that moment. The creatures weren't just dying out naturally. They were choosing to evolve, to become something beyond physical existence. But they couldn't take that final step until they were certain their world would be cared for by worthy successors. What do you need me to do? Marcus asked. The creatures exchanged more of their flowing scale communications before the leader turned back to him. The mental contact deepened, and Marcus found himself seeing through their eyes, understanding their perspective on the human colony. The humans were good people, the creatures seemed to say, but they were thinking too small. They saw Kepler 442b as a resource to be exploited, not as a partner to be understood. The mining operations were crude and wasteful, extracting materials without understanding their true purpose. But more importantly, the humans were alone. They had traveled across the galaxy carrying all their old fears and divisions with them. They still thought in terms of nations and corporations, of competition and scarcity. They hadn't yet learned the fundamental truth that had allowed the original inhabitants to transcend physical existence. Everything was connected. Every living thing, every world, every star was part of a vast, interconnected web of consciousness that stretched across the universe. Until humanity learned to see themselves as part of that greater whole, they would remain trapped in cycles of conflict and limitation. You want me to teach them, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. The creature's agreement came with images of what could be. He saw the human colony growing and changing, becoming something more than just another mining outpost. He saw humans and the remaining evolved beings working together, not just to extract resources, but to understand the deeper secrets of the universe. He saw ships leaving Kepler 442b carrying not just humans, but a new understanding, spreading across the galaxy like seeds of consciousness. He saw a future where humanity joined the vast community of evolved species that existed beyond the purely physical realm. But he also saw the dangers. If humanity continued on its current path, if they remained focused only on material gain and territorial expansion, they would eventually destroy themselves. The pattern had played out countless times across the galaxy. Species would reach the stars only to carry their primitive destructiveness with them, creating conflicts that spanned solar systems. How long do I have? Marcus asked. The answer came with a sense of urgency that made his heart race. The evolutionary process that was claiming the creatures couldn't be stopped or delayed much longer. Within a few years, possibly less, the last of them would be forced to either complete their transformation or die. The window for making contact with humanity was closing rapidly. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. 15 years old, and somehow the future of human civilization was being placed in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him that he couldn't even convince his mother to let him stay out past dark. But these advanced beings expected him to guide humanity toward transcendence. The communicator in his pocket crackled to life, making all four beings jump. His mother's voice cut through the alien night like a sword through silk. "Marcus, where are you? Your 30 minutes were up an hour ago, and there are energy readings coming from your location that are off the charts." Marcus grabbed his communicator, his heart pounding as he realized how much time had passed. The mental connection with the creatures had made minutes feel like hours, and apparently the reverse was also true. "Mom, I'm okay," he called into the device. "But you need to listen to me. Don't send a security team. I'm not in danger, but I'm not alone either." Static filled the channel for several long seconds before Sarah's voice came back, tight with worry and barely controlled anger. "Marcus Chen, you have exactly 60 seconds to explain why the atmospheric sensors are detecting massive energy fluctuations at your location, and why our seismic equipment is registering what looks like controlled electromagnetic pulses." The lead creature moved closer to Marcus, and he felt its mental presence like a warm pressure against his thoughts. It was offering to help him communicate, to share the contact with his mother. The idea was both terrifying and appealing. "Mom, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," Marcus began, accepting the creature's offered mental link. "But I need you to listen with your scientist brain." "Not your mother brain. I'm listening," Sarah replied, though her tone suggested she was preparing for the worst. Marcus took a deep breath and opened his mind fully to the creature's influence. "There are intelligent life forms on this planet. They've been here for millions of years, and they've been waiting for us. They're not hostile, but they're different. More advanced than anything in our surveys suggested." The silence from the communicator stretched so long that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Sarah's voice came back, carefully controlled. "Marcus, I need you to move away from whatever energy source is affecting you. Long-term exposure to unknown radiation could be causing hallucinations." "It's not radiation, Mom. They're telepathic. They've been showing me the history of this planet, and they need our help." Another long pause. "Son, I'm coming to get you. Stay exactly where you are." "No," Marcus said urgently. "If you come with weapons or a security team, they might leave. They're already barely physical. Most of their species has evolved beyond needing bodies. These three stayed behind just to make contact with us." The creature's mental touch deepened, and suddenly Marcus felt his mother's presence at the edge of the telepathic link. It was subtle, like a whisper at the very edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Sarah's scientific mind, trained to observe and analyze, was picking up the psychic spillover from the creature's communication. "Marcus," Sarah's voice came through the communicator, but now it carried a note of wonder. I'm reading electromagnetic patterns here that don't match any natural phenomena. They're too organized, too structured. It's almost like language," Marcus finished, "because that's exactly what it is." The creatures had apparently decided that subtle contact wasn't enough. The lead being directed its attention toward the research station, and Marcus felt the telepathic link expand to fully include his mother. Sarah's gasp of shock came clearly through the communicator. "Dear God," she whispered. "Marcus, I can feel them in my mind. They're real." "Dr. Chen," Marcus said formally, "I'd like you to meet the original inhabitants of Kepler 442b." What followed was the most extraordinary scientific first contact in human history, conducted through a 15-year-old boy and a handheld communicator. The creatures, who had no names in any human sense but identified themselves through complex emotional signatures, shared their story directly with Sarah's mind. She learned about the great transcendence that had claimed their civilization, the choice to remain behind as guardians, and the careful preparation of the planet for humanity's arrival. More importantly, she learned about humanity's potential future and the critical choice that lay ahead. "This is impossible," Sarah muttered, though her scientific training was already analyzing and cataloging everything she was experiencing. Evolutionary transcendence, post-physical existence, telepathic communication. None of this fits our understanding of biology or physics. The creature's response came with gentle amusement. Human science, they suggested, was still in its infancy. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than humans imagined. What seemed impossible was simply the natural progression of consciousness, freed from the limitations of purely material thinking. But why us? Sarah asked. Why humans? Surely there are more advanced species out there who would be better candidates for this kind of inheritance. The answer came with a warmth that made both humans feel suddenly, inexplicably hopeful. Humans were chosen not despite their limitations, but because of them. They were young enough to adapt, diverse enough to find new solutions, and stubborn enough to never give up. Most importantly, they had proven themselves capable of love that transcended genetic programming. The creatures shared images of humans caring for children who weren't their own, of people risking their lives for strangers, of entire societies reorganizing themselves to protect their weakest members. These behaviors, illogical from a purely evolutionary standpoint, marked humans as a species capable of the consciousness expansion necessary for transcendence. What do you need from us? Sarah asked, her scientific mind already racing ahead to implications and possibilities. The answer was both simple and terrifyingly complex. The creatures needed humanity to become what they were capable of becoming, not through some magical transformation, but through the slow, difficult work of growing beyond their current limitations. The mining operation had to change. Instead of strip mining the planet for resources, humans needed to learn to work with the living systems that had been carefully cultivated over millions of years. The mineral deposits were gifts, but they were meant to be used wisely, not depleted. More importantly, humanity needed to stop thinking of Kepler 442b as just another colony. It was meant to be a school, a place where humans could learn the fundamental interconnectedness of all existence. The knowledge gained here would then spread outward as humans carried their expanded consciousness to other worlds. You're asking us to change our entire civilization, Sarah said slowly. Not change, came the reply, along with images of butterflies emerging from chrysalises. Grow. Become what you already have the potential to be. The creatures shared visions of what human civilization could become. They showed cities that grew like living things, technology that worked in harmony with natural systems, and humans who could communicate not just with each other, but with the very fabric of reality itself. But they also shared the darker possibilities. Humans who rejected growth, who clung to old patterns of dominance and exploitation, who spread across the galaxy like a virus, consuming and destroying everything they touched. Species that chose that path eventually destroyed themselves, leaving only dead worlds as monuments to their short-sightedness. How long do we have? Sarah asked, echoing her son's earlier question. The answer came with urgency that made both humans shiver. The transcendence couldn't be delayed much longer. The last guardians were already beginning to fade, their connection to physical reality growing tenuous. If humanity couldn't be guided onto the right path within the next few years, the knowledge would be lost, and humans would be left to find their own way forward. History suggested that species rarely succeeded without guidance from their predecessors. We need to bring the other colonists here, Marcus said suddenly. They need to experience this for themselves. The creature's response was immediate and negative. The telepathic contact required specific conditions, the right combination of electromagnetic fields, planetary alignment, and mental openness. It couldn't be reproduced at will, and attempting to force it might damage both the humans and the creatures. Then how do we convince them? Sarah asked. How do we make them understand that everything needs to change based on a telepathic conversation with invisible aliens? The answer came with what felt like alien laughter, the same way humans had always learned and grown, through evidence, experience, and the gradual accumulation of undeniable truth. The creatures had left other gifts scattered across the planet. Technologies that would only activate when humans were ready to use them responsibly, art and architecture that would gradually reveal the planet's true history, and most importantly, the beacon that Marcus had discovered, which would continue to call to other young open minds. Change would come slowly, person by person, discovery by discovery. But it would come, as long as the first seeds were planted correctly. The mental connection began to fade as the planetary alignment shifted, but not before the creatures shared one final, crucial piece of information. The beacon Marcus had discovered was just one of 12 scattered across the planet. Each one was designed to activate different aspects of human consciousness, gradually preparing them for the eventual transcendence. But there was a catch. The beacons would only work if approached by humans who had already been touched by the first contact. The awakening had to spread naturally from person to person, like ripples in a pond. You're making us responsible for our own evolution, Sarah realized. The creature's agreement came with approval, and what felt suspiciously like pride. This was exactly the kind of thinking that marked humans as ready for advancement. They were beginning to understand that growth couldn't be imposed from outside. It had to come from within. As the telepathic link finally dissolved, the three creatures began to shimmer, their physical forms becoming translucent in the moonlight. They were beautiful and terrible and utterly alien, and Marcus felt a profound sadness at the thought that he might never see them again. "Wait," he called out. "Will we be able to contact you again?" The lead creature's response came as a whisper in his mind, barely audible. "When you are ready, you will not need to contact us. You will be us." Then they were gone, not vanishing, but simply becoming too ethereal to perceive. Marcus and his mother were alone among the alien rock formations, with only the glowing beacon and their shared memories as proof that the encounter had been real. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, "nobody's going to believe us." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her scientific mind processing everything that had happened. "No," she agreed finally. "They won't. Not without evidence." She pulled out her handheld scanner and began taking readings of the beacon. The device immediately began displaying energy patterns unlike anything in their database. The electromagnetic signatures were stable and consistent, clearly artificial but unlike any human technology. "This is good," Sarah murmured, saving the data. "This is something concrete, but we're going to need more than scanner readings to convince colonial administration that we need to completely restructure our entire operation." Marcus stood and brushed the dust from his clothes, his mind already working on the problem. The creatures said there were other beacons. If we can find them, document them, maybe even get other people to experience what we just experienced. It would take years, Sarah pointed out. Maybe decades. And that's assuming we can even find the other sites without triggering a full-scale archaeological survey that might damage them. They began the walk back to the research station in thoughtful silence. The alien landscape looked different now, not just beautiful but purposeful. Every rock formation, every unusual plant growth, every strange mineral deposit might be part of the vast garden the creatures had described. "There's something else," Marcus said, as they navigated between the crystal outcroppings. "Something they showed me that I don't think you got through the link." Sarah looked at him expectantly. "The mining operation isn't just wasteful," Marcus continued. "It's actually dangerous. The materials we're extracting are components of a planetary system that's been maintaining the ecosystem for millions of years. If we keep strip mining without understanding what we're doing, we could destabilize the entire planet." Sarah stopped walking. "How dangerous?" "Atmospheric collapse dangerous. Maybe worse." They reached the research station to find it in chaos. The energy readings from Marcus's location had triggered every sensor in the facility, and Dr. James Morrison, the expedition leader, was in the communications room trying to raise colonial headquarters. "Sarah," "Thank God," Morrison said as they entered. "We detected massive electromagnetic disturbances from your son's location. I was about to authorize a full search and rescue mission." "That won't be necessary," Sarah replied carefully. "But we do need to talk, all of us. And we need to suspend mining operations immediately." Morrison's expression shifted from relief to alarm. "Suspend operations? Sarah, do you have any idea what that would cost? We're talking about millions of credits and equipment downtime, not to mention the contractual obligations to the Colonial Development Corporation." "James, what would it cost if we accidentally destabilized the planet's ecosystem?" Morrison stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "What are you talking about?" The environmental surveys were exhaustive. This planet is geologically stable, with minimal indigenous life. There's no way our mining operations could cause any significant ecological damage. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. This was going to be even more difficult than they'd anticipated. "The surveys were incomplete," Sarah said carefully. "There are aspects of this planet that we didn't detect with our standard equipment." What kind of aspects? Morrison demanded. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Intelligent life. The silence in the communications room was deafening. The other research staff, who had been monitoring the conversation, turned to stare at Sarah with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disbelief. "Sarah," Morrison said slowly, "I need you to report to the medical bay for a full neurological scan. Exposure to unknown energy sources can cause hallucinations and—" "I'm not hallucinating," Sarah interrupted. "And I have scanner data to prove it." She connected her handheld device to the station's main computer and uploaded the readings from the beacon. The energy patterns appeared on the main display screen, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team's physicist, whistled softly. "These readings are incredible. The electromagnetic coherence is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's almost like organized information." "Because that's exactly what it is," Marcus said. "It's a communication beacon left by the indigenous population." Morrison's face was growing red. "Indigenous population? We've been here 6 months. We've surveyed every square kilometer of this continent. There is no indigenous population." "Not anymore," Sarah said. "Most of them evolved beyond physical existence millennia ago. But some stayed behind to make contact with whoever came next." The room erupted in crosstalk as the research team argued about the implications. Morrison was insisting on immediate medical evaluations for both Sarah and Marcus. Dr. Vasquez was demanding more data about the energy readings. The communications officer was asking whether he should report the contact to Colonial headquarters. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the station's observation windows, he could see lights moving in the distance. Not the random flicker of reflected starlight, but organized patterns that pulsed and shifted like living things. "Mom," he said urgently, cutting through the arguments. "Look outside." The entire research team turned to the windows and fell silent. Across the alien landscape, dozens of beacons were coming to life. They pulsed in synchronized patterns, creating a web of light that stretched to the horizon and beyond. "How many did you say there were?" Sarah whispered. 12 major ones," Marcus replied. "But I think there are smaller ones too. Maybe hundreds of them." Morrison sank into a chair, staring at the light show. "This changes everything. If there really is an indigenous population, if they have this level of technology, Colonial administration will want to establish formal diplomatic contact." "No," Marcus said firmly. "That's not what they want. They're trying to teach us, not negotiate with us." "You can't possibly know that," Morrison protested. Marcus looked at the man who had been skeptical just moments before and felt a moment of clarity. The beacons weren't just coming online randomly. They were responding to the conversation, to the presence of humans who were beginning to understand. "Dr. Morrison," Marcus said formally, "would you be willing to come with me to examine one of the smaller beacons? I think they want to make contact with you too." Morrison looked at the lights dancing across the landscape, then at the impossible energy readings on his computer screen. His scientific training warred with his administrative responsibilities and his basic common sense. "Against my better judgment," he said finally, "yes, but we go together as a team, with full sensor equipment and safety protocols." Sarah smiled for the first time since the encounter began. "That's exactly what they're hoping for." The expedition to the nearest beacon took place the following morning, after a night of fevered preparation. Morrison had insisted on full scientific protocols, which meant sensor packages, recording equipment, and enough backup power to run a small city. Dr. Vasquez had spent most of the night analyzing the energy patterns, while the communications officer had struggled with whether to report the discovery to Colonial headquarters. Marcus had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the echo of the creature's mental touch, like a song heard from far away. The experience had changed something fundamental in how he perceived the world around him. Colors seemed more vivid, patterns more meaningful, and he found himself noticing connections between things that he'd never seen before. The beacon they approached was smaller than the one Marcus had originally discovered, but no less impressive. It rose from a grove of the planet's tree-like organisms, which had apparently grown around it over centuries. The crystalline structure pulsed with soft light that seemed to respond to their approach. "Energy readings are off the charts," Dr. Vasquez reported, checking her instruments. but the radiation levels are completely safe. Whatever this technology is, it's incredibly sophisticated. Morrison was taking detailed photographs from every angle, his earlier skepticism replaced by scientific fascination. The construction techniques are unlike anything in our database. It's almost as if the crystal grew into this shape naturally, but the geometric precision suggests deliberate design. Because it's both, Marcus said. They didn't build these things the way we build machines. They grew them like plants, but guided the growth with conscious intention. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her scanner. How could you possibly know that? Marcus exchanged glances with his mother. They had agreed not to mention the telepathic contact until the others experienced it for themselves. The creatures had suggested that direct revelation would only create resistance and fear. It's just a theory, Marcus said carefully, based on the organic curves in the structure. As they set up their equipment around the beacon, Marcus noticed that Dr. Vasquez kept rubbing her temples and shaking her head, as if trying to clear away cobwebs. Morrison was displaying similar symptoms, periodically pausing in his work to stare at the beacon with a puzzled expression. Is anyone else hearing that? Dr. Vasquez asked suddenly. Hearing what? Morrison replied, though he was tilting his head as if listening to something. It's like music, but not quite. More like a conversation in a language I almost understand. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The beacon was beginning to establish contact with the other researchers, just as the creatures had predicted. But he could sense their resistance, their rational minds trying to reject what they were experiencing. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said gently, I want you to stop fighting it. Just let yourself listen. Fighting what? Morrison demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He was swaying slightly, as if the ground beneath his feet had become unsteady. The contact, Marcus said simply. They're trying to communicate with you. Dr. Vasquez dropped her scanner and pressed both hands to her head. This is impossible. Telepathic communication violates everything we know about neural biology and... Her words cut off abruptly as her eyes went wide. Marcus could feel the moment when her mental barriers finally collapsed, when the creature's gentle presence flowed into her consciousness like water into a dry riverbed. Morrison lasted another 30 seconds before the same thing happened to him. One moment he was insisting that mass hallucinations were more likely than alien contact, and the next he was sitting heavily on the ground, staring at the beacon with wonder and terror in equal measure. Dear God, he whispered. They're real. They're actually real. What followed was a repeat of the previous night's revelations, but compressed and intensified. The creatures working through the smaller beacon shared their history and their purpose with the two newcomers. But this time Marcus noticed the communication was different. More structured, more purposeful. The creatures weren't just sharing information anymore. They were teaching. Dr. Vasquez was the first to understand. As a physicist, she grasped the implications of consciousness-based technology faster than the others. They're showing me equations, she said in amazement. Mathematical relationships that describe the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics. This is revolutionary. This rewrites everything we know about the nature of reality. Morrison's experience was different but equally profound. As the expedition leader, he was being shown the broader implications of humanity's presence on Kepler 442b. He saw the colonial expansion from the creature's perspective, not as human progress, but as a species taking its first tentative steps toward a larger destiny. We're not just colonists, he said slowly. We're students. This entire planet is a classroom, and we've been treating it like a strip mine. The mental contact lasted for nearly an hour, during which the four humans experienced a crash course in post-physical existence. They learned about the network of evolved species that existed throughout the galaxy, beings who had transcended the need for physical form, but who maintained interest in the development of younger races. They learned that consciousness wasn't produced by the brain, but rather channeled through it. Physical existence was just one phase of development, like a caterpillar stage before becoming a butterfly. The creatures of Kepler 442b had made that transition millions of years ago, but they maintained the ability to interact with physical reality when necessary. Most importantly, they learned that humanity was approaching a critical juncture. The next few decades would determine whether humans joined the galactic community of evolved beings or destroyed themselves through the same short-sighted thinking that had devastated Earth's Environment. The choice is ours, Morrison said as the mental contact began to fade. But the consequences affect everyone. When the communication finally ended, the four humans sat in stunned silence around the now dormant beacon. The weight of what they had learned was almost overwhelming. We have to change everything, Dr. Vasquez said finally. Our entire approach to this planet, to space colonization, to human development, everything. How? Morrison asked. How do we convince colonial administration that we need to abandon a multi-billion credit mining operation based on telepathic contact with invisible aliens? We don't, Sarah replied. We prove it. We use what they've taught us to demonstrate technologies that shouldn't be possible. We show results that can't be explained by conventional science. Marcus stood and walked to the beacon, placing his hand on its crystalline surface. The structure responded immediately, pulsing with renewed light and emitting a harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in their bones. They've given us access to their knowledge, he said. Not all of it, but enough to get started. Dr. Vasquez, those equations you saw, can you reproduce them? I think so, she replied, pulling out her tablet and beginning to sketch rapidly. At least the basic principles. But Marcus, some of these formulas describe energy relationships that would require completely new material science to implement. Materials that happen to be abundant in the mineral deposits we've been mining, Morrison realized. They weren't just preparing this planet for colonization. They were preparing it for education. The implications hit all of them simultaneously. The entire mining operation could be converted from resource extraction to research and development. Instead of shipping raw materials back to Earth, they could develop new technologies based on the creature's teachings and eventually establish Kepler 442b as a center for advanced human development. It would take years to convince the Colonial Development Corporation, Morrison said. Maybe decades, and that's assuming they don't just replace us with a more cooperative research team. Then we don't ask permission, Sarah said firmly. We develop proof-of-concept technologies using the materials we've already extracted. Once we can demonstrate practical applications of consciousness-based physics, the economic incentives will align themselves. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her equations, excitement growing in her voice. Some of these principles could revolutionize space travel. If consciousness can directly interface with quantum fields, we might be able to develop propulsion systems that work by manipulating space-time itself, and communication systems that work instantly across any distance, Morrison added, his administrative mind already grasping the commercial possibilities. The first human colony to master these technologies would have an insurmountable advantage in galactic expansion. Marcus felt a surge of optimism for the first time since the encounter began. The creatures had been wise to choose humans. Give them a problem and they would find a solution. Give them an opportunity for advancement, and they would pursue it with relentless determination. There's just one thing, he said, dampening their enthusiasm slightly. The creatures made it clear that this knowledge comes with responsibility. We can't use it just for human advantage. The whole point is to evolve beyond that kind of thinking. The others considered this soberly. It was one thing to accept revolutionary new science and another entirely to fundamentally change human nature. Then we make sure the benefits spread, Sarah said finally. We develop the technology. 6 months after first contact, Research Station Alpha had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a simple mining outpost now resembled a fusion of human engineering and alien architecture. The consciousness-based technologies that Dr. Vasquez had developed from the creature's equations required a completely different approach to construction and power generation. The breakthrough had come when Marcus realized that the beacon materials weren't just crystalline structures. They were conscious interfaces designed to respond to focused human intention. Once the research team learned to work with the materials instead of simply extracting them, progress accelerated exponentially. Power output is holding steady at 200% of theoretical maximum, Dr. Vasquez reported from the main laboratory. She was monitoring a device that looked like a sculpture made of living light, its crystalline components shifting and flowing in response to quantum fluctuations that conventional physics said shouldn't exist. How is that possible? Asked Dr. Chen Wei, the new physicist who had arrived with the latest supply ship. The Colonial Development Corporation had been sending additional researchers ever since Morrison's initial reports had reached Earth, though the full truth about the alien contact remained classified at the highest levels. Consciousness amplifies quantum coherence, Dr. Vasquez explained patiently. She had given this lecture dozens of times to the stream of visiting scientists. When human intention interfaces directly with quantum fields through the crystal matrices, it creates feedback loops that generate more energy than we put in. It's not violating conservation of energy. It's tapping into the zero-point field. Dr. Chen Wei shook his head in bewilderment. That should be impossible. The zero-point field is a theoretical construct. You can't extract energy from it without violating the laws of thermodynamics. Marcus looked up from his own workstation, where he was calibrating a communication array that could supposedly send messages instantly across galactic distances. The laws of thermodynamics assume a purely material universe. Once you factor in consciousness as a fundamental force, the mathematics change completely. The young man had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. The shy, curious teenager who had first encountered the alien creatures had become something of a prodigy, displaying an intuitive understanding of consciousness-based physics that amazed even the professional scientists. The creature's mental touch had awakened something in him that went beyond normal human capabilities. "Show me the equations again," Dr. Chen Wei requested, still struggling to accept what he was seeing. Dr. Vasquez pulled up the holographic display that had become the centerpiece of their research. The mathematical relationships floated in three-dimensional space, depicting the intersection of consciousness, quantum mechanics, and space-time geometry. To a conventional physicist, they looked like elaborate fantasy. To the researchers who had experienced alien contact, they were the foundation of a new reality. The key insight is that consciousness isn't produced by matter, Dr. Vasquez explained. Matter is produced by consciousness. Physical reality is the result of conscious observation, collapsing quantum possibilities into specific outcomes. Once you understand that, you can learn to control the process. Dr. Chen Wei studied the equations with growing excitement. If this is true, if consciousness really is the fundamental force, we could manipulate matter at the atomic level just by thinking about it. We could travel faster than light by consciousness shifting our position in space-time. We could create artificial gravity, manipulate time. We could do all of that, Morrison agreed, entering the laboratory with Sarah. But should we? The creatures were very clear about the responsibilities that come with this knowledge. The past 6 months had been a constant balancing act between scientific advancement and ethical constraints. Every new breakthrough raised questions about how the technology should be used and who should have access to it. The creatures' teachings emphasized that consciousness-based abilities could only be developed by beings who had evolved beyond purely selfish motivations. "The latest test results are encouraging," Sarah reported, pulling up data from her tablet. "The consciousness expansion training is showing measurable results in 73% of participants. People who complete the program demonstrate increased empathy, expanded awareness, and improved ability to interface with the crystal matrices." The training program had been Marcus's idea. If humans were going to use consciousness-based technology responsibly, they needed to develop the mental and emotional maturity to handle it properly. The program combined meditation techniques derived from Earth's wisdom traditions with practical exercises in quantum consciousness manipulation. "What about the other 27%? Dr. Chen Wei asked. "They show improved technological aptitude but without the corresponding ethical development," Morrison replied grimly. "We've had to restrict their access to the more advanced applications. It was the same problem that had plagued human development throughout history. Technological advancement without moral growth led to increasingly sophisticated ways of causing harm. The consciousness-based technologies were so powerful that in the wrong hands they could literally reshape reality. That's why the expansion can't be rushed," Marcus said, looking up from his communication array. "The creatures spent millions of years developing the wisdom to use these abilities properly. We're trying to compress that development into decades." "Speaking of which," Sarah said, "I've been in contact with the other research teams. The Beacon Network is responding to human development faster than the creatures predicted. Sites that were dormant just months ago are now coming online as more people experience consciousness expansion. The phenomenon had surprised everyone, including the alien entities themselves. The beacon network was designed to activate gradually over centuries as humanity slowly evolved. Instead, it was responding to the rapid changes taking place among the colonists, creating a feedback loop that accelerated development even further. It's like the planet itself is becoming more conscious, Dr. Vasquez observed. The crystal matrices are growing, connecting, creating a kind of technological nervous system that spans continents. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. The creatures mentioned that this was how their own transcendence began. Individual consciousness expansion eventually reached a critical mass that triggered planetary awakening. Are you saying that Kepler 442b is becoming alive? Dr. Chen Wei asked skeptically. Not becoming alive, Marcus corrected. Becoming aware. The planet was always alive in a biological sense. Now it's developing consciousness. The implications were staggering. If an entire planet could develop consciousness through the interaction of evolved beings and consciousness-based technology, then the universe might be far more aware and purposeful than anyone had imagined. There's something else, Morrison said, his expression growing serious. I've been receiving increasing pressure from colonial headquarters to accelerate technology transfer. They want practical applications they can implement across human space, not philosophical discussions about cosmic consciousness. The political situation had been growing tenser as word of the technological breakthroughs spread through human space. Every colonial government wanted access to the consciousness-based technologies, but none of them wanted to accept the ethical constraints that came with them. What kind of pressure? Sarah asked. The kind that comes with the threat of replacing our entire research team with more cooperative personnel, Morrison replied. Apparently, some people in the Colonial Development Corporation believe we're holding back vital strategic technologies for idealistic reasons. Marcus felt a chill of premonition. The creatures had warned that this moment would come, when humanity would be forced to choose between the easy path of technological advancement and the difficult path of consciousness evolution. They can't just take over the research, Doctor. Vasquez protested. The technology only works for people who have undergone consciousness expansion. You can't just hand it over to conventional engineers. That's what I told them, Morrison said. But they seem to think they can reverse engineer the applications without understanding the underlying principles. They'll destroy everything, Marcus said flatly. The consciousness-based technologies aren't just advanced machines. They're living systems that respond to the mental and emotional state of their operators. Without proper development, they'll either shut down or become dangerous. Then we need to make sure the technology spreads to people who will use it responsibly before it falls into the wrong hands, Sarah concluded. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. They were facing the same choice that had confronted every evolving species throughout galactic history: share their advancement freely and risk it being misused, or try to control it and risk stagnation. The creatures have been preparing for this, Marcus said suddenly. They knew this moment would come. They've been teaching me something beyond the basic technologies. He walked to the central communication array and placed his hands on the crystal interface. The device responded immediately, but instead of its usual gentle glow, it blazed with light that filled the entire laboratory. Laboratory? Marcus, what are you doing? Sarah called out in alarm. Something the creatures call the Great Awakening, Marcus replied, his voice strangely resonant. If humanity is going to evolve, it has to be all of humanity, not just the people who happen to be in the right place at the right time. The communication array began transmitting on frequencies that conventional science said didn't exist, sending consciousness expansion patterns directly into the quantum field that connected all living beings. Across human space, on dozens of worlds and thousands of ships, people suddenly found themselves experiencing the same mental expansion that had begun on Kepler 442b. You're triggering consciousness evolution across the entire human species, Dr. Vasquez breathed in amazement. With their consent, Marcus said, the signal only affects people who are ready for it, who choose to accept it. But now the choice is available to everyone. As the transmission continued, reports began coming in from across human space. Scientific breakthroughs, artistic inspirations, and spiritual awakenings were occurring simultaneously on dozens of worlds. The consciousness expansion that had taken months to develop on Kepler 442b was happening in hours for people who were ready to receive it. Humanity's transformation had begun. Laboratory. Marcus, what are you doing? Sarah called out in alarm. Something the creatures call the Great Awakening, Marcus replied, his voice strangely resonant. If humanity is going to evolve, it has to be all of humanity, not just the people who happen to be in the right place at the right time. The communication array began transmitting on frequencies that conventional science said didn't exist, sending consciousness expansion patterns directly into the quantum field that connected all living beings. Across human space, on dozens of worlds and thousands of ships, people suddenly found themselves experiencing the same mental expansion that had begun on Kepler 442b. You're triggering consciousness evolution across the entire human species, Dr. Vasquez breathed in amazement. With their consent, Marcus said, the signal only affects people who are ready for it, who choose to accept it. But now the choice is available to everyone. As the transmission continued, reports began coming in from across human space. Scientific breakthroughs, artistic inspirations, and spiritual awakenings were occurring simultaneously on dozens of worlds. The consciousness expansion that had taken months to develop on Kepler 442b was happening in hours for people who were ready to receive it. Humanity's transformation had begun. 5 years after the Great Awakening, the human colonies had been transformed beyond recognition. The consciousness-based technologies had spread throughout human space, but not in the way the Colonial Development Corporation had originally envisioned. Instead of being controlled by governments and mega-corporations, the technologies had become available to anyone who demonstrated the necessary mental and ethical development to use them safely. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Harmony Station, watching ships arrive from across the galaxy. They weren't all human ships anymore. Word of humanity's consciousness breakthrough had spread through the network of evolved species, and representatives from dozens of post-physical civilizations had come to witness what they called the youngest species to achieve transcendence while maintaining physical form. The Zephyrian delegation is requesting permission to interface directly with the planetary consciousness, Sarah reported, consulting the holographic display that floated beside her. As Director of Interspecies Relations, she had become humanity's primary liaison with the various non-physical beings who were now regular visitors to Kepler 442b. Granted, Marcus replied, but remind them that the planet is still in its early stages of awakening. Direct consciousness interface should be gentle and respectful. The transformation of Kepler 442b into a fully conscious world had exceeded everyone's expectations. The beacon network had evolved into a planetary nervous system that could think, feel, and communicate with both its human inhabitants and visiting consciousness-based entities. The planet had become a unique hybrid, a physical world with transcendent awareness. How are the integration projects proceeding? Marcus asked, pulling up status reports from across human space. Better than predicted, Sarah replied with a smile. The consciousness expansion has reached approximately 40% of the human population, with new awakenings occurring daily. More importantly, the ethical development is keeping pace with the technological advancement. That had been the crucial factor in humanity's successful evolution. Unlike many species that achieved technological transcendence, humans had managed to develop wisdom alongside power. The consciousness expansion didn't just grant access to advanced abilities, it fundamentally changed how people thought about themselves and their relationships with others. Any resistance movements? Marcus inquired. Sarah's expression darkened slightly. Some. There are still groups who reject consciousness expansion and want to return to purely material technology. They've established several isolated colonies where consciousness-based tech is banned, but they're a shrinking minority. The resistance had been expected. Not everyone was ready for consciousness evolution, and forcing it would violate the very principles that made it possible. The solution had been to allow people to choose their own level of development, while ensuring that consciousness-based technologies remained available to those who wanted them. Dr. Vasquez approached from the research wing, her latest report glowing in holographic form around her. The transcendence threshold calculations are complete, she announced. Based on current expansion rates, humanity should achieve species-wide consciousness evolution within the next 50 years. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. 50 years was incredibly fast by galactic standards, but it felt like an eternity when viewed from human perspective. What about individual transcendence? How many people are ready to make the transition to post-physical existence? Several thousand, Dr. Vasquez replied, but most are choosing to remain in physical form to help guide the species transition. The creatures were right. The final evolution has to be a collective choice, not an individual one. That was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of humanity's development. Unlike the original inhabitants of Kepler 442b, who had transcended individually over millions of years, humans were evolving as a unified species. People who achieved the ability to exist beyond physical form were choosing to stay embodied until everyone could make the transition together. The Galactic Consciousness Council is requesting a formal meeting, Sarah reported, highlighting a new message in her display. They want to discuss humanity's potential membership in the Transcendent Alliance. Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The Transcendent Alliance was the governing body for all post-physical civilizations, a cosmic democracy of evolved consciousness that guided the development of younger species. Membership would mean recognition as a fully mature galactic civilization, but it would also mean taking responsibility for helping other developing species. Schedule the meeting, Marcus decided, but make it clear that any decisions about Alliance membership will require consensus from the entire human consciousness network. That was another unique aspect of humanity's evolution. Instead of being governed by representatives or leaders, decisions were made through direct consciousness consensus among all expanded humans. It was a form of democracy that transcended politics, based on shared awareness rather than competing interests. Marcus, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, there's something else. The original creatures, the ones who first made contact with you, they're beginning to manifest more frequently. I think they're preparing for something. Marcus had noticed it too. The alien entities who had guided humanity's first steps toward consciousness expansion had been largely absent during the development years, allowing humans to find their own path. But recently, they had been appearing more often, not just on Kepler 442b but throughout human space. They're getting ready to complete their own transcendence, Marcus realized. They've been waiting to make sure we were established before taking the final step. The implications were profound. The creatures had spent millions of years in a transitional state, maintaining just enough physical existence to guide humanity's development. Once they were certain that humans could carry on the work of planetary consciousness and species evolution, they would finally be free to join their transcended kin. That means we're about to become the senior species in this region of the galaxy, Sarah observed. Other developing civilizations will be looking to us for guidance. Marcus walked to the viewing port and gazed out at the starfield beyond, Kepler 442b. Somewhere among those stars were other worlds with other species just beginning their journey toward consciousness evolution. Humanity, the youngest species to achieve transcendence, would soon become teachers and guides for civilizations that were still struggling with the challenges that humans had faced just years before. Are we ready for that responsibility? Dr. Vasquez asked. Marcus thought about the question seriously. 5 years ago, he had been a curious teenager exploring alien rock formations. Now he was helping to guide his entire species toward a form of existence that most humans couldn't even imagine. The transformation had been so rapid, so complete, that sometimes he could barely remember what it felt like to be purely physical. No, he said finally. We're not ready. But then again, no species ever is. The creatures weren't ready when they first encountered evolving consciousness millions of years ago. But readiness isn't the point. Willingness is. As if summoned by his words, 3 familiar forms materialized on the observation deck. The original creatures, now almost entirely translucent, appeared as they had that first night when Marcus was surrounded by what he thought were ferocious alien wolves. But now Marcus could see them clearly for what they had always been. Teachers, guides, and friends who had sacrificed their own final evolution to ensure that another species could join the community of transcendent consciousness. The circle completes, the lead creature communicated, its mental voice carrying overtones of joy and satisfaction. The student becomes the teacher. The seeker becomes the guide. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," the creature replied, "you help others find what you have found. You become for them what we became for you. The galaxy grows more conscious, more aware, more capable of the love that connects all existence." The creatures began to fade, their long vigil finally ending, but their last communication carried a warmth that would remain with Marcus forever. "Remember," they whispered across the quantum field. "Every species that achieves transcendence does so in their own way. Guide others, but do not try to make them into copies of humanity. The universe grows stronger through diversity, not uniformity." And then they were gone, not just invisible, but truly transcended, joining the vast network of post-physical consciousness that stretched across the galaxy and beyond. Marcus, Sarah, and Dr. Vasquez stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight and wonder of the responsibility that had just been passed to them. Humanity was no longer the student species struggling to understand cosmic consciousness. They were now the teachers, the guides, the ones who would help other civilizations find their own paths to transcendence. In the distance, new ships were arriving at Harmony Station. Some carried humans from the far reaches of human space. Others carried representatives of species that were just beginning to suspect that consciousness might be more than an emergent property of complex brains. The real work was just beginning. But as Marcus watched the stars beyond, Kepler the B, he felt a deep certainty that humanity was ready for the challenge, not because they were perfect, not because they had all the answers, but because they had learned the fundamental truth that the creatures had tried to teach them from the very beginning. Everything was connected. Every consciousness, every world, every star was part of a vast living web of awareness that grew stronger every time another species joined it. Humanity's role now was to help that web grow, one consciousness at a time, one species at a time, until the entire universe awakened to its own infinite potential. The ferocious alien wolves had been right. The impossible had happened. A young, aggressive species had learned to transcend its limitations and become something greater than anyone had dared to dream. And this was just the beginning.